is a chapter review for Vinland Saga 192, and Yukimura chooses to start us off with the cold open here, so I'm going to get into the chapter title in a little bit, but before we get going, I want to go over my expectations for this chapter and how they kind of held up. So last chapter preview hinted that this chapter would focus on the shaman preventing the prophecy, and if you've watched any of my videos since the prophecy was introduced, you'd know I'm very cautiously optimistic about this prophecy. I'm very hesitant on it, but I'm eager to see how Yukimura handles it, because I believe if handled right and handled intelligently within the scope of the narrative, this is a very smart inclusion for the sake of the meta narrative. And you can watch my videos on 189 and 190 to kind of get a better feel for what I'm talking about there. But I've been kind of eager to see how it goes. So I expected this chapter to be a little bit more focused on the shaman and his perspective, so we can kind of get some insight into how he's thinking. But Yukimura chose to kind of take a different approach here and structure this conflict a little bit differently from what I expected, and I think it's actually a very strong start. So let's get into it with first this cold open. So we have Einar and Thorfinn setting up a cenotaph, and on the cenotaph is the word friður, and this is Old Norse, and this means peace. And for people who have read Vinland Saga for this long and watched my videos where I've said this already, this is finally where Thorfinn is making a place for his victims' souls to rest, like he said he would do back in the farm arc. We've been waiting on the payoff to this for so long, and it's honestly just awesome to finally see it come to fruition and not get left behind. Now, I think the moment here is a little bit more subdued than I would have liked. I think it could have been a more powerful moment to kind of follow up on this, but either way, I think it's done very well because of some aspects I'm going to get into in a minute. But Carly tries to read the word, and Carly's able to read it because Carly's a genius, and Hild taught him. So that's cool for Carly, but Carly doesn't understand and thinks Friður is a name. And Thorfinn says, don't actually know the name. And then Thorfinn continues that this is for the many people whose names he doesn't know. So then Carly asks, why Friður? And Thorfinn says he doesn't know any other letters, but he doesn't need anything more than this. I think this is really, really great, because I see this as Thorfinn's acknowledgement that this act does not represent his absolution from what he's done. This is not about him finally taking the weight off his shoulders and getting rid of the weight of the souls, as much as it's about him offering this peace to them and offering them the chance to rest if they want. I don't think Thorfinn will ever truly move on and forgive himself. That's not what acknowledging your wrongdoings is about. He will live with this burden forever. He's not simply saying, okay, I've done all I need to do. He knows there's more to do, and he needs to live for the people who he took the privilege of living away from. And I think it's great that he's not just kind of letting it go. He at least feels that now, after the harvest, after he's kind of reaped the rewards of all the work everyone's put in, and they've harvested the wheat, they've made bread, they've eaten the bread, and after all that, he has been given forgiveness from somebody he has hurt through Hild. So after all that, he at least feels that he can offer this peace to them and dedicate it to them. And I think that's great. I think, even though I wanted a little bit more of a heavier scene from the creation of this grave, the cenotaph, I think it was handled very well, and Yukimura very accurately acknowledges that Thorfinn isn't just done. He did not succeed in his mission. He's only offering this piece to them. But here we are at the title page after that cold open, chapter 192, Thousand Year Voyage, part 1. So this is very exciting. This is the start of a new major arc, and this is going to probably just carry the Vinland arc to its end. Much like how the Baltic Sea War was the sort of major arc of the overall Eastern Expedition arc, this is probably the kind of real meat of the Vinland arc. And I think with this name, Yukimura really drives home that this is the end of like our peaceful interlude here. Because ever since Sailing West ended, we've kind of had these episodic chapters with their unique names, and they all have a kind of specific message or theme that they're going for. They're kind of very isolated within themselves, and they're all kind of about a unique idea that plays into the setup of the Vinland arc and the Vinland conflict. So this is kind of really driving home that after the harvest, something new is beginning. And with this name as well, I think it's very interesting of how unique it is among other Vinland Saga arc titles. Because for the most part, when a Vinland Saga arc has a title given in the like the chapter names, then it's pretty just straightforward in what it's being named, in that it's usually just kind of about what's happening in the arc. And many major arcs, like the farm arc, don't really have an official name. Like you'll see it be referred to as the slave arc, the farm arc, but it doesn't have a cohesive title. It was very kind of episodic, like the chapters leading up to this one in Vinland. So this is really unique because it feels like instead of being just straightforward named after what's happening, like Baltic Sea War, this has a sort of deeper underlying meaning that we kind of need to piece together as we're given more chapters. And I have like some ideas of what this could mean, but I think I want to get into that after we've done the read through so I don't spend the entire video on the title page. So let's continue. So the chapter starts in full here with Vargar returning from his supply trip to Greenland. So back in chapter 190, after talking about the harvest, Vargar sets off to go to Greenland and Iceland to kind of get more supplies. And this shows, again, we've had another kind of jump in time, and we've been getting a lot of kind of mini time skips through the seasons and everything across these chapters. So he left sometime probably near the end of the winter, maybe leading into the spring a little bit, and now in the summer after the harvest he's come back. So we've been getting a lot of these time skips, but I think now that we're in this part 1 of a major arc like this, we're going to kind of have a more consistent flow of time between chapters. But Vargar is back, and although everyone on the crew is okay, he has some bad news. Something terrible appears to have happened in the Markland settlement. So as they are on their way back, when they're passing by the Markland settlement, about to disembark, they were fired at from the coast. And they got an arrow. 3 arrows were shot at them, and showing this arrow to Thorfinn, he immediately recognizes that this is Lanu. Now, we have to keep in mind, Thorfinn and the settlers have a very limited perspective and worldview right now. To them, Lanu means all natives. Not all natives are Lanu. This is just how the tribe that we have met refer to themselves. But obviously to Thorfinn and the settlers, all natives are Lanu, just like to the natives, all white people are the Norse. Because in their limited worldview, that is the kind of knowledge that they're working with. So he's not pointing the finger at the tribe that we know and we've seen them become friendly with. He's acknowledging that this is from a native. But Vargar says that he sees this as a warning, saying, don't stop here. And he chooses to leave, so not to risk anything. And Thorfinn agrees that this was a good judgment. But Vargar wants to go back and check on the situation, and Thorfinn agrees that they will leave as soon as possible, and they'll start preparing a ship. But as they're walking away, Avar was listening in, and he says he's coming as well to prepare for war. So once again, Avar expecting the worst, as he always does, and hopefully he does not cause any problems by coming along. But 8 days later, the three of them, alongside some of Vargar's men in the ship here, arrive at Markland. And they point over there, say that's where the arrow comes from, and then Thorfinn says, and I think this is really important to keep in mind for later discussion, the Lanu are expert bowmen. Be careful, keep a distance. So Thorfinn's like acknowledging that if they wanted to shoot them and hit them, they will do it. They won't miss, is what he's getting at. But they notice that it's quiet. So Thorfinn takes a pot and a stick and he just starts banging it. And he's essentially just doing this to signal their presence. He wants to make their presence known immediately and not appear to be threatening to anybody who may be near, whether it's natives or the settlers still at the settlement. He doesn't want to be kind of like sneaky about it. He wants to establish communication as soon as possible to avoid any further escalation of the problem. But after he makes their presence known, the only movement they see is a deer leaving the settlement, and Thorfinn looking very distraught. And kind of, you can see by the speech bubbles here, he's kind of wavering a little bit. And he's saying the presence of a deer means that there's no humans in the settlement. So they disembark, and they come to one of the homes of the settlement. And Thorfinn opens the door, and nobody's inside. And looking at the home here, it appears to have just been entirely cleared out. As if nobody had ever been there. And despite the people being missing, you can see there's no signs of destruction or even a struggle. No blood, no corpses, nothing. And as Thorfinn comes outside, we see there's like a sea of arrows covering the settlement. And Thorfinn's like questioning it. Why? Why is there no destruction despite the scale of this attack? And then some of Vargar's men come. And they tell Thorfinn that there's no sign of human or animal corpses. But then he makes a point. What are all these arrows supposed to mean? It's wasteful to leave all of these arrows here and not gather them back up. And Thorfinn, you can see in the bottom left, he starts to kind of think about this a little bit. But into the night, they're gathered around a fire, and Thorfinn continues to hit the pot. Thorfinn says he can't sense anyone around them and concludes that either nobody's around or they're just being ignored. And Ivar is incredibly frustrated with this, and he starts questioning what Thorfinn is even going to do by inviting the attackers over and giving away their presence like this. Because he does not see this the same way Thorfinn does. Thorfinn sees this as establishing communication instantly and avoiding the possibility of misunderstanding. Ivar sees this as, you're giving us away and we're losing any strategic advantage we even had. But Thorfinn says he just wants to talk. He literally just wants to understand and communicate and avoid escalation. But Ivar, getting more annoyed, sarcastically asks Thorfinn if he speaks Lanu. But Thorfinn tells him that even with this kind of limited language barrier, they can still communicate through other means, like expressions and gestures. And again, more frustrated, Ivar gestures over to the arrows and yells that these people are clearly not up for talks, since he believes, at least, that they killed all the Markland settlers. And Vargar tries to kind of reason a little bit here, and he says that there's no bodies, no boats. It's possible the settlers packed up themselves and left. And Ivar asks, why didn't they show up in Vinland then? But Vargar reminds him they wouldn't know how to get there. They were left at the Markland settlement to kind of be this checkpoint, and they've never traveled themselves to the main Vinland settlement. So they wouldn't know how to get there. And Vargar being positive, he tells Thorfinn that if they're out there, they're going to find them. And Thorfinn believes they're alive as well. But what's important here, he hesitates to send the boats. He hesitates to kind of take their limited supply of ships and send them aimlessly searching. And what's interesting that this directly calls back to chapter 182, where Ivar insisted that they build up their defenses and requested that Thorfinn lend him a carpenter to build a new ship. And if you remember, Thorfinn shut this idea down. He didn't want to assume the worst of the natives, and he wanted to just focus on cultivation. And now you can see, because of this decision as a leader, that's coming back to bite him. And you can kind of see these little failings of Thorfinn, and they really remind me of the prologue and of Askeladd, and these small minor choices he makes that his band just don't understand, and it slowly leads to them turning on him. So it's very reminiscent of Askeladd here, and I really like that kind of callback. But Thorfinn says that regretfully they're going to head back to Vinland at dawn, and Ivar reaches just the peak of his frustration here, and he stands up and he stands over Thorfinn. And then he tells him, "This is your fault. Because of you, we lost 13 people and 1 ship, all because of your stupid experiment." And Vargar loyally defends Thorfinn here. I love this characterization for Vargar, and I love that he is still present. He wasn't just a one-off character. I love how his loyalty to somebody and his desire for leadership and his respect for Thorfinn is showing through here. And I really hope we continue to see more of him, because I really appreciate his kind of loyalty here. But he tells Ivar, watch your tone. And then he goes to say, if he were still, and he gets cut off. I think he was very likely about to say, if he were still commander of the Jomsvikings, but he got cut off. Because Ivar goes to say, if only they had proper weapons, they wouldn't have fallen. And he says that he knows Vargar thinks the same, and Vargar stays silent. He does not immediately refute that, because it's probably true. And Ivar tells Thorfinn that he needs to just buy weapons from Halfdan before things gets worse, and that it's not too late to kind of prevent a real tragedy from occurring. He turns to walk away, and he leaves Thorfinn with this: Vinland does not belong to you alone. And I think this is a brilliant line to close on, because Vinland is ideologically, in Thorfinn's head, a dream of a land of peace where nothing like war and slavery will happen. In his head, he is doing an ultimately good thing here, and the right thing. But Ivar acknowledges that it does not just belong to Thorfinn. Not only in the sense of you have backers you need to satisfy, and you have other settlers that you need to care for and protect, but also in the way that Ivar is not intending, Vinland also belongs to the people who were here first. Again, Ivar is not defending them and saying that Thorfinn needs to respect their boundaries, because he doesn't really care about that, but we can at least read into it in that way as well, and think about it that way, that Thorfinn needs to acknowledge that what if the people who are already here don't want him here? What if they ask him to leave? What if they're scared that he's here? Is it right for him to push on either way? And I think that's the kind of thing Thorfinn sits at this fire and ponders on. I think he thinks not only about how can I protect my people, it's also how can I protect and respect the people who were already here. And then that ends the chapter. So let's get into the analysis, and I want to talk immediately more about this argument scene because it is really brilliant. So this scene actually calls back to chapter 182. This is where Thorfinn and Ivar were having another ideological argument beside the fire, and I have it pulled up here. So here, like I said before, this is where Thorfinn was disagreeing with the idea of building another ship, and Ivar was saying, okay, we're on an island, we need another ship to, like, build up our defenses, and Thorfinn turns this down. And Ivar very angrily says Thorfinn's failing as a leader by not preparing for everything. He's actively putting their lives in danger. And then his argument kind of ends up circling around to, I think it's normal to like war, and it's not normal that you hate war. And while Ivar does have a good point here about building this boat, it would be a good call. But in that Thorfinn needs to be prepared. Like, these are good points that Thorfinn has a lot of lives riding on this, and that his idealistic world may not be what reality has in store. But he comes off as immature here because the argument ends up just coming back around to liking war is normal and I like war. And even though Ivar's kind of standing above Thorfinn here very, like, menacingly and imposingly, Thorfinn kind of looks up at him at disappointment because he believes Ivar just doesn't understand what he understands. He sees ignorance, not somebody who's making a good point. Ivar, although he's in this powerful position above Thorfinn, he doesn't actually hold any power in this debate. But if we go back to this chapter, Ivar has a good point here. In this instance, his argument cannot just be written off based on his ignorance and his immaturity. Here, he's been given tangible evidence towards Thorfinn's failings as a leader and the threat the natives could potentially pose to them. His argument has essentially shifted from, watch where your ideas get us, your ideas won't go well, this is not how the world works, to, look, this is where your ideas have gotten us. And it makes a huge difference in shifting the power dynamic. Because instead of looking up at Ivar disapprovingly, as if he is kind of ignorant, almost like a child, Thorfinn can only look down regretfully because he's wavering. Because Ivar has a point, and he delivers it in a much more powerful and knowledgeable way here. Even though, still, he's overreacting. He's not looking at the big picture. He thinks they're all dead, despite all the evidence contrary to that. And he's still kind of overly emotional about it. But he can't simply be refuted anymore because the proof is right there. But speaking about this event, let's talk more about what I think happened here in Markland. So throughout the chapter, I think we are given enough hints to kind of piece together what likely happened to some extent. I think the most telling piece of evidence by far is just the arrows left on the ground along the entire settlement. So one of Vargar's men, he again remarks about the kind of wastefulness of leaving them there. So the arrows were not shot at the settlement as an attack, rather as a warning for whoever comes to investigate. The tribe in the area would essentially just be making a show of strength to try to scare off the settlers. And based on the relatively clean and undamaged state of the settlement as well, and the missing boat, I think it's very likely the settlers were threatened into leaving and then chose to leave on their own accord. Obviously, when you're threatened to do something, you don't really have much of a choice, but I don't think they were attacked and forced out. I believe they were threatened and forced out. And we also noted that Vargar's ship was shot with arrows as a message. So Thorfinn later mentions how the Lanu are experts with the bow, like I pointed out. And I think that kind of makes it clear that if they intended to hurt somebody, at least one of those 3 arrows shot at the ship would have actually hit a person. I think it's most likely the ship was just the intended target. This was, again, just a warning, not a full attack with the intent to harm. So this, combined with the state of the settlement, I think makes it pretty clear that the natives wanted to kind of posture strong here and send a threatening message in an attempt to peacefully drive the Norse away. The arrows shot at Vargar's ship kind of both acted as a warning to not come closer, but also doubles as a message to go tell Thorfinn, go get your leader and show him what happened here. Because ultimately that makes this message meant for the main settlement. It's almost an indirect attack on the main settlement by going for Markland as a message. And this kind of all leads into the question of why did this happen? Why would a tribe in a completely different part of the area just attack like this and create a threat? Again, like I said before, this is certainly not an attack from the tribe we've come to know in Vinland. The evidence that this message was meant to reach the settlement, though, at least shows, I think, that it's not an isolated incident. This is not happening independent to the events back at the main settlement. And this kind of brings us back to the chapter preview, which implies that this chapter would be about the shaman attempting to prevent his vision from coming true. So since the vision chapter, we've jumped forward in time. We've jumped from midwinter, around midwinter at least, to the summer after the harvest, without any sign of conflict between the settlers and the natives at the main settlement. And based on how the shaman woke up from that vision and what he endured, it would be very strange for him to come to and then just do nothing for all this time. And in chapter 183, which I also have up here, when we meet the shaman for the first time, we learn a lot about him. We learn that he is an advisor. He says, I'm only an advisor, and he's not explicitly telling them what to do. He just came to tell them what he knows. So he essentially comes around to other tribes and he advises them and he gives information about what he knows because he is a very respected elder. And we also know he's very knowledgeable of the land outside the island. He talks about how he's traveled in his youth, and he talks to them about how nobody on this island makes fields, so it's natural you wouldn't know. He clearly has knowledge and a kind of larger kind of view of the broader scale of North America and how other tribes act and how other tribes live. So I believe he's aware of the Markland settlement. They've communicated a lot with Thorfinn's tribe in general, Thorfinn's settlement in general. So I think he would be eventually aware of the Markland settlement. And I think during this kind of time skip from midwinter to summer, he would have traveled there, and as an advisor, he warned the tribe in the area about his vision. And I think he likely chose to start with Markland to minimize the possibility of casualties on either side because it's a smaller settlement and has less defenses. It's kind of left pretty vulnerable on its own. And knowing that the larger settlement is like the real threat, he uses Markland to send a message to them. So the goal of using weapons as a threat to maintain peace displays this kind of irony that Vinland Saga is like consistently trying to show, where peace is dictated by those with the sharpest weapons, not by those who have laid their weapons down already. And Thorfinn is trying to break this mold and all of this because he believes that this is how conflict comes to, when communication is handled indirectly through weapons and threats rather than mutual conversation and understanding. And it's interesting because this way of creating peace by kind of posturing strong and dominating, it calls back to Canute's method of how he plans to bring about his paradise by forcefully making it so. And if everybody is under Canute and he has full control over everybody, then he has full control of peace. And it all comes through his domination and power, not through the mutual understanding and mutual desire. So what will come from this attack then? The chapter preview sort of hints a little bit about the same fate awaiting Vinland, but I want to think about for a little bit what the kind of immediate repercussions of this event will be. So, assuming that what we've put together through these hints is the truth, the settlers of Markland left to kind of find the main settlement on their own accord. I think that they, at the very least, left alive. But it's also possible that they could have been taken hostages by the natives, but I think the missing boat pretty much makes it clear that the settlers would have left on it. And if not, then that would mean the natives got rid of it, which I think just isn't likely. I think they likely tried to leave. But I think it's more likely that they left the ship, either attempting to find Thorfinn or retreat to Greenland. Could be either one. Now, Vargar just came from Greenland, and he did not see them. And they also, like we said before, they don't know how to get to the main settlement. And if we look back to the chapter where the Markland settlement was established, which is here, we see that Thorfinn asks them specifically, do you know how to handle a boat? And the best response he gets is, I guess, we're fishermen after all, but you have to consider, fishing in the local waters of like Iceland and Greenland is not the same as traveling long distance between two destinations in a unknown sea. Crossing the ocean to get back to Greenland is certainly out of their reach, and then they don't even know how to find Thorfinn and where the Vinland settlement is. So it's a kind of a foolish choice to say that this response, I guess, is enough to say like they would be able to get away, because Thorfinn here is not considering that they'll have to leave. Because Thorfinn, again, he's in this idealistic mindset of how things will go. So I think it's likely that if they were forced to leave and they're not very confident in their ability to sail and handle a boat, I think it's likely they're going to leave, try to either find the Vinland settlement or try to get back to Greenland, and then that will result in an accident that leads to their deaths. I think this would be a smart way for Yukimura to kind of start the conflict, since the first casualties will be sort of indirectly killed by the natives, but the natives also ultimately did not intend to harm them. So it's kind of a very realistic point of tension that's kind of, at the same time, hard to communicate and resolve. Because often with stories like this where there's misunderstandings, it becomes frustrating to watch. Because you think, okay, why don't they just talk? It's a very clear misunderstanding. But here, if somebody indirectly dies, even though the natives did not intend to cause any harm, they can't just simply talk that out. So the kind of weight of this completely changes because of that. And it makes this conflict very human and very real. But going back to our chapter, I want to talk about what I think the chapter title and this new arc title is all about. 1,000 Year Voyage. I have some basic ideas of what I think this potentially represents. First, I think it's very important to note, and kind of the biggest kind of smoking gun here, is that the current year in the narrative is sometime around the year 1022. And that would make the story take place around 1,000 years ago from the modern day. And on top of this, the vision chapter. This kind of acted as a way for Yukimura to show the reader the relevant history of how the world will turn out, and how North America will turn out, and how the fate of the native people will turn out, despite Thorfinn's idealism. I still don't think Yukimura would kind of muddy the story and the themes and the kind of grounded nature of Vinland Saga by introducing the element of time into the narrative any more than for the sake of the meta narrative like I've discussed before. But I personally believe Thousand Year Voyage is intended to represent the voyage taken by the story's themes and messages across time to us in the modern day. So this kind of plays into the aspect of the meta-narrative that I discussed before with chapters 189 and 190, where the idea is that Thorfinn will inevitably fail, but there is an importance in living by the ideals of a true warrior despite this failure. And this kind of plays into the purpose of Vinland Saga, the purpose of telling this story, despite the failure it will end up in. And that's to allow this message to make the 1,000-year voyage to us, where we live in a world where I think, and Yukimura thinks, we still need to hear this message. Despite how Thorfinn's story will end, what matters is the voyage of his ideals. And that's what I think this arc is all about. So, overall thoughts on the chapter. I've been pretty open about my hesitation towards the idea of the prophecy and how it will play in the story. And I felt like a lot really rided on this chapter and how Yukimura uses the prophecy in the conflict. And I'm happy to say that this chapter kind of marks a really strong start to the conflict. And it's really eased my worries a lot. I'm glad the context of the vision and like the exact sort of what is happening in those visions, like seeing guns despite guns clearly not existing at this time, and seeing a like atomic bomb, like obviously these are things that are so beyond the scope of the characters in the story. And I think if those exact kind of details ended up being so paramount in how the conflict played out, then the story would kind of lean too much into this idea of self-fulfilling prophecies in the literal kind of mystical sense, and I think that would really weaken Vinland Saga. But this inciting incident doesn't really have either side acting, I would say, unreasonably or overreacting in a way that kind of forfeits the realism of this narrative, because we have the natives who they just want to prevent a future that will harm them. And despite the fact that they had like this vision that we as readers know is showing the real future, that doesn't necessarily matter as much when the real purpose of that vision in the narrative is the result rather than the contents. And the contents are, like I've said before, meant for the reader. It's meant to display this kind of relevant history that is important for us to acknowledge to understand the larger message and meta-narrative going on here. So the strategies of the natives to send a threatening message here without really resorting to violence is a really perfect beginning, especially if the unintended consequences naturally escalate the intensity, like I said before, with the potential of the Markland settlers getting into an accident at sea, and them leaving the settlement without the proper knowledge of sailing leading to their deaths. I think Yukimura ultimately knows that in a natural and real human conflict, nobody's looking for war as much as they either want something or they're afraid of losing something. Thorfinn wants to create a land of peace with no war and without slavery. The natives are afraid of losing their culture and their home and their way of life and their connection to their ancestors and the spirits and the forest. These are real kind of human motivations, and neither side wants violence, and that is the perfect way to kind of start the downfall here, because it's very real. And even though in reality there are wars started by people who simply want to take something. And even though that is a real circumstance, it is very human to have people not wanting war as much as their fears are getting to them and end up kind of culminating in it. But that's pretty much it for this chapter. So let's think about next chapter predictions here. So our kind of highlight here, well, sorry, the preview rather, is the same fate awaiting Vinland. I think it's kind of hard to say what will come in the next chapter. You know, we've kind of talked about the mystery that's being set up here. That's kind of a very important aspect of this chapter. So I've kind of laid out already what I think will happen as a whole and my general expectations for the conflict. So I don't really have a direct prediction for what I think is going to come next chapter, because this preview doesn't really directly hint towards a certain event, as much as I think it instills this unease and doubt in the reader to kind of give us the same feeling of doubt that Thorfinn's having and kind of bring us into his headspace, get us thinking what's going to happen to Vinland. And still, thinking about what could happen specifically next chapter, I think if the settlers who left Markland did end up trying to find the Vinland settlement and failed, we could possibly find evidence of this accident on the way back from Markland. And Yukimura has really, really well paced this arc so far, the Vinland arc as a whole, not just Thousand Year Voyage. So there hasn't been a lot of kind of wasted time. So I think it's kind of likely that within the next chapter or two, we learn what happened to the Markland settlers. I don't think this will be something that lingers over the arc for too long. But ultimately, that'll have to wait, because that's going to do it for this chapter review. This was definitely a meaty one. I have a 7-page script here and 7 pages of notes, so hopefully this one didn't end up too long and I made good use of this time. But we'll see what happens next month. So until then, thank you for watching, and I will see you then. Bye.